do it. Well, I don't feel like I love God very much. It doesn't matter. Just tell him you love him. Just keep telling him you love him. And then just keep doing that. And then over the course of time, they start to recognize, actually, they are starting to love him. They are starting to, and it's the same thing with human beings, right? In the sense that if we're being charitable to people, we have to start making acts of love for them for God's sake, which basically means praying for them, doing certain things for God's sake in relationship to them. And then over the course of time, our charity towards them will increase. We cannot cause it on our own. Being warm and sappy towards somebody is not going to increase your charity. What's going to increase your charity, praying for them, willing what's best for them on a regular, but for God's sake, ultimately. Wanting to see God in their life, okay? And not for a selfish motive, right? I want God in their life so I don't have to deal with them. Yeah? It's not that. Okay. So this act of love is a supernatural act, and as a result, God has to give us an infused virtue so that we can perform it. And that means the way that we increase virtue, that charity, even for our neighbors, so that we can love them better, is telling God we love him at regular intervals and doing it regularly. The concomitant side to that then also means if I'm willing to good for another person, then I have to be willing to suffer in relationship to that person. Any emotional negative reaction is a sign that I haven't mastered that virtue. And anytime I react contrary to charity, I increase those vices and disorders, and it's going to block the operations of charity. That brings up a very important point. It's going to block the operations of charity. That brings up a very important point. St. Thomas says that an infused virtue becomes operative, it becomes more and more operative from an increase in the virtue. But it also becomes more operative from a removal of any natural vices which block its operation. So, for example, everybody who is in the state of grace has infused temperance. Right? Even the guy who's obese, 350 pounds, if he's in the state of grace and he's woofing down his fourth Big Mac, right? He may not be committing a mortal sin yet, and so he's in the state of grace. And they're like, well, wait a minute, if he has infused temperance, what's with the fourth Big Mac, right? And the reason being is because he's got the vice of intemperance. And so the natural vice of intemperance blocks the infused virtue of temperance from its operation. And he says that's why once you remove that vice, the natural vice, this is why you have to remove your defects. As you remove your defects and remove those things and start building natural virtue, then the supernatural virtue starts to just operate because it's not being blocked. It's the same thing here with charity. If you don't have if you're not performing acts of love on a regular basis, and then when the suffering comes in relationship to the individual, you still do not, but you will the evil in relationship to that person, that habit in the will blocks charity from being performed in a relationship to them. You have to be willing to suffer that and still be, which basically means I still want the good for them despite what I'm going through on my side. Acts of virtue on a regular basis, removing any obstacles that could be causing that. The other part is keeping the perspective, this finality, this propter diem. It's all about perspective. This is where the rubber meets the road with the traditionalists, because the traditionalists are losing their perspective. They see how bad things are in the church, and they're like Chicken Little running around, saying all sorts of stuff that's just ridiculous. And the problem is that as I mentioned, they're losing their perspective, and so they easily degenerate into a lack of charity. How do we keep our perspective when we have all sorts of heresy? In fact, we are living in modernism, which is a synthesis of all heresies. There's not a single doctrine of the Catholic Church. There's not a single moral practice of the Catholic Church. There's not a single liturgical practice of the Church that isn't under full-blown attack right now. That's just the nature of the circumstances which we live in. As I've mentioned before in other conferences, this should not affect our perspective at all. And there's two reasons for it. One is it doesn't matter what other people do. St. Thomas says we can't take that as scandal to affect our own action. That's called passive scandal. And he said that's sinful. You can't do that. The second part, so it doesn't matter what anyone does in the church. It doesn't matter what any prelate in the church does. It doesn't matter what any priest in the church does. It should not affect your faith or your virtue or your perspective on any of this. If for no other reason, the church said, well, these people are sinful, so they can commit anything. The second component is we knew all this was going to happen. We knew it. We've been told for a century and a half by Our Lady, this is what's going to happen. We were told by Our Lady at La Salette that the priests are cesspools of impurity. Well, why should 150 years later, when there hasn't been any substantial rooting of that problem out, that we think that somehow or another we should be scandalized at the pedophilia? I mean, the other thing is that, we talk about Fatima. If you actually look at what Our Lady was telling us in Fatima, she said she wanted the Pope to consecrate Russia by name. And what she was telling, she said, otherwise it will spread her errors. Russia will spread her errors. Okay. What she was telling us is that either Russia will become the blessing of humanity because it will be converted, and in that conversion, the impact geopolitically would be staggering, or it will be our punishment. Russia will be used as an instrument of our punishment. Well, we didn't do what we were supposed to do, and here we are. Right? So there shouldn't be any shocking that the church got infiltrated by communists. We shouldn't be shocked that it got infiltrated by Freemasons. We shouldn't be shocked at the fact that we have bishops who have, imploded morally. We already know, we were told that we shouldn't be shocked by the fact that the bishops are infighting and the cardinals are infighting. Why? Because she said it, Akita, bishop will be against bishop and cardinal will be against cardinal. We were told all of this. We shouldn't be at all scammed. In fact, what it should tell us is that our perspective should be even more solidified in the truth of the Catholic faith, in these revelations, in our Lord, in Our Lady. It should be even more solidified in that. It tells you how pusillanimous we are, and it tells us how weak we are, that, some cardinal gets up there and says something that's extraordinarily daft, and everybody knows it's daft. He even knows it's daft, but he still says it anyway. And we all get tore up about it. We shouldn't be getting tore up about it. It shouldn't affect our perspective in the slightest. What it should do is indicate to us this guy needs our prayers. As a matter of charity, I'm going to pray for this guy. Or as a matter of charity, I'm going to offer up my sufferings for this guy. Even when they're attacking you personally, it should not affect your perception. If your charity was perfect, your will and your intellect would be so focused on God that in that particular moment, all you would be seeing is either God in this person in some fashion or the necessity of bringing God into the situation. But we don't. What we tend to do is we tend to become, we follow the way of all flesh. Somebody does something negative against us, and so we retaliate. It's an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But what's becoming in our culture, though, is because people are so unhinged. So even basic reasoning isn't being followed. That tells you how much reason they're following their emotions. And therein lies the story, the moral to the story. The moral of the story is you have to get to the point where you are not following your emotions in your reactions in relationship to other people. If you're going to maintain charity, even in the worst situations and even in the crisis within the church and seeing all these bad things and dealing with all these bad things, because I know that a lot of people have had to deal with a lot of garbage, even traditional parishioners have had to deal with a lot of garbage at the hands of the traditional priests. The fact of the matter is, if you're going to maintain your charity, you've got to stop following your emotions. Okay? Stop following your emotions. Okay? And you're going to have to keep your focus on God, which means you're going to follow Him. Right? Okay. So you have to be willing to suffer, you have to keep your focus, and you have to be working on increasing your love for God, which tells me you have to performing acts of charity at regular intervals. That's how you're going to keep your focus in this crisis. It's, one of the things that I've noticed in our own culture, when you look at how things were on a cultural level 100 years ago, or even put it, well, not in the 20s, because 20s was a bit of a mixed bag. But let's just say in the 30s and 40s, my grandfathers, when their generation, when they were raising kids and that type of thing, there was a certain civility and right order that people just had, right? And I thought to myself, how did we go from that to the greatest generation which inherited that, but by the time they got done, they handed us a financially, spiritually, and morally bankrupt church. They handed us a culture that had been basically destroyed. I mean, what happened? And I basically came to the conclusion that God decided to retract His grace because they were unwilling to suffer. It was retraction of grace. Once they decided they just didn't want to suffer, then God's out, right? And that's why I said to maintain the charity, you have to be willing to suffer. But you see that in their generation, they didn't want to suffer, they didn't want to embrace their cross, and as a result of that, that's why it imploded. There was a retraction of God's grace during that generation, and I think there was a kind of a warning. I mean, I think the fact that Our Lady appeared in Fatima in 1917 was a warning. This is coming. And once he retracts his grace, then it's impossible to keep evil people from infiltrating the church and the culture, or keeping evil people from gaining ascendancy. It's just impossible. Because if God retracts his grace, then good men don't do what they're supposed to do to protect it.